Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Post-Cop26, the GC's View, Unlocking the Potential of In-House Lawyers. I'm Anna Balbuck. I'm the editor of the Global Green Guide at the Legal 500, and I will be moderating today's session together with my colleague, Chris Lakopoulos, who is research editor and the head of the private practice power list at Legalese. Of course, I'm also joined here by our three esteemed speakers, Pamela Cohn, Silvio Carvalho, and Yasmin Devishimolu. And so I'll briefly introduce them as well. Pamela is a founder and CEO of consulting firm Amity Advisory. She has more than 3 decades of experience working in business development with four professional services firms with a particular focus on ESG, social impact and sustainability programs. She also serves as the VP Social Impact and Sustainability Officer at Milliman, which is a global actuarial consulting firm. And then we have Silvio. Welcome to Silvio. He's a GC at Pillarstone, where he's been since 2016. Pillarstone is a platform sponsored by KKR and established with the aim to partner with European banks to manage their exposure to non-core and underperforming assets. Before that, he worked in private practice, advising private equity and hedge funds, and also in the enforcement and financial crime division of the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. And yeah, last but not least, also welcome and hello and thank you to Yasmin, who is a GC for Uberal, which is a digital location marketing solution with offices in 6 different countries. She advises the C-level management team and global units in all areas of business, so from intercompany agreements to IP, licensing, compliance, including data protection, and dispute resolution, mainly commercial arbitration. So thank you very much to you all for joining us today, and we're really excited to hear from you. Today's webinar is in fact a sort of a follow-up webinar after our finance and net zero webinar, which we hosted live from COP26 back in November. And we felt that it was very important to reflect on these outcomes of COP26 and also to sort of, again, look ahead at sort of the next steps in the transition to net zero economy. We're now sort of 3-4 months on from COP26. This week, in fact, the new IPCC report was released. It shows that actually the impacts of global warming are now irreversible. About 40% of the population are highly vulnerable due to climate change, and keeping temperature rise below the 1.5 degrees Celsius is really the only way to reduce those losses. And we are very much at a key moment to take action. So in a nutshell, the report shows that the situation, yes, is indeed very bad, but it also shows that the future depends on us and how we go forward. So we believe that GCs are in a very strong position to drive these conversations around the climate crisis. So we wanted to today delve even deeper into how GCs can influence their respective companies, policies, and also kind of look at how this has developed since COP26. In our previous webinar, we also raised the notion that this shift to net zero can actually present some opportunities. So today we will also want to return to this notion that it can perhaps turn into a competitive advantage. Without further ado, I will now pass over to my colleague Chris, who will present a very short slideshow, presenting in part some of the data that we already saw from our webinar at COP26, but also obviously most importantly, revealing the results of our new survey. When you registered for the webinar, you will have seen that we this time asked 4 short questions within the survey, and yeah, we're excited to present to you the results of that now. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anna, and good afternoon to everyone. It's wonderful to be here to having these conversations with you. Before we get into it, we just wanted to have a very brief look at some of the data from the previous webinar that we did, and just to sort of set the stage, as it were, for some of the answers for today's webinar on what some of the opinions from our audiences. So as you can see, back in December, I believe Anna was lucky enough to go to Glasgow and speak to a lot of important people in COP26. And one of the questions, that question, I believe, was quite successful in that it engaged a lot of people, and it seemed to stir up conversation quite a bit, which we were really, really happy about. And one of the things that was one of the main takeaways, I believe, was that there was a consensus that people, a very strong consensus that people tend to view in-house counsel as very important to overall corporate strategy, how organizations work. We tend to view them as very central. And also, there was also a consensus, it seemed like, that setting net zero targets was very necessary for the smooth functioning of companies and organizations in general. So we have these two important points. So first and foremost, GCs are very important overall company strategy, and net zero policies are important for that same strategy. So it follows from that GCs have a very important component to play, a very important role in helping companies reach net zero targets. And we believe that was something that was quite a strong belief. You know, the data seemed to verify that. And we were assuming that the picture would have been very similar 3 months later, but we were slightly surprised at the fact that it seemed like in the follow-up, the results seem to suggest that the role overall of GCs isn't strongly perceived this time. It's not as clear-cut, it seems. So we're not sure whether that suggests that the challenges of reaching net zero are much more layered and cannot be strictly cannot come back strictly to GCs, or whether or not the conversation isn't as strong or as vibrant around these areas 3 months on. So we just wanted to. Some of the main talking points were that yes, participants seemed a bit more skeptical about the prospect of reaching net zero targets, and most importantly, again, a bit of a skepticism regarding the centrality of GCs within their companies. And given, as Anna mentioned, the recent IPCC report, it seems obvious to us at the Legal 500 that it really isn't something up for debate, that these targets have to be met, if nothing else, just because it's the fiduciary responsibility of these companies to act now and ensure that they have a future in which they can thrive and grow under the new circumstances. So we were slightly perplexed by this data, and we thought that this is something that we do approach so much from an ideological point of view, but really because we care passionately about helping lawyers be the best counsel they can be for their companies. And we just want to facilitate this conversation to bring these wonderful experts here and get their opinion on it, because this is one of the main privileges of being at the Legal 500, to be able to connect and speak to people. And if we can engage in conversation, that is something we'll be happy to do, really. So that's all from me. And at this point, Anna, I think I'm going to go back to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so as we can see, slightly maybe unexpected data results there. But yeah, I would now, without further ado, just like to pass over to our speakers to hear from them about, what's been your experience? What do you think about this data, especially the newest data now, sort of 3 months on from COP26? Don't know who would like to kick off. Maybe I don't know, Sylvia. What as a GC, what's been your experience?
Thank you very much, Anna, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I think the results from the survey are very interesting. In particular, if one thinks that one of the key sort of takeaways from COP was the emphasis placed on the need to enlist the private sector to actually deliver net zero. And what in particular surprises me is the fact that respondents appear to be very cautious in terms of how they perceive the potential impact of failing to reach net zero on the financial prospects and the financial performances of their companies in the medium to long term. Because I think there's a wealth of evidence that points in the completely opposite direction. in the direction that, in fact, those companies that will not be prepared to confront the transition to net zero are actually at risk of extinction in the short to medium term. And just to mention a couple of examples arising out of the conversation of COP. So in Glasgow, financial institutions representing roughly 40% of the total financial assets in the world, and some, I think, 130 trillion US dollars in value, committed to mainstreaming and accelerating the transition to net zero. And that's for the market perspective. And as regards the, let's say, legal and regulatory framework, the UK government announced that as of 2023, listed companies and certain financial institutions will be required to publish their climate transition plans, with an emphasis on how they will be reaching net zero. So I think the results from the survey are very, again, interesting, because they are a reminder, from my perspective, of at least a couple of points. The first one is that the ESG and, let's say, environmental, in particular, maturity levels vary quite a lot, and there's quite a lot of volatility within corporations, probably depending upon a number of factors: the industry, the capital structure of the company, pressure coming from stakeholders and investors, pressure coming from consumers, the actual size of the company, geography. And the second reminder, I think, is that for some corporations and for some general counsel within those corporations, net zero and the climate transition can be quite an abstract objective, or quite an ideological sort of, or abstract or non-concrete pursuit, until such point in time as when the company is actually hit with very concrete market realities. And if you watch the movie Don't Look Up, you probably know what I'm talking about, right? So people don't realize the effects of what might be coming until there's a comet that might be hitting Earth in a short while. And that is pretty much the same argument that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, made, that companies need to get prepared for the climate transition, otherwise they risk seeing a huge outflow of capital that will be reallocated to more mature competitors.
Thank you, Silvio. It is very interesting to think that, you know, on a financial landscape, companies might be facing an extinction-like event similar to what might be happening in the biosphere. And, you know, this might be a bit of a precursor in that regard. Before we turn to other panelists, and we would love to get your opinion, we would just like to add that one of the elements of these webinars that we really treasure is interactivity. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to type them in, and we will put them to our experts at the appropriate time. And, you know, interactivity is the very spirit of what brings us together. So please feel free to chip in or to add any comments. And without any further ado, if any other of our panelists wanted to add anything to this point, I would invite them to do so.
Yeah, so I think I can just underline what Silvio said. Regarding the timeline from your first survey to the second, which is only 3 months apart, this is very short period in something regulatory trickling down to companies, right? Look at the GDPR, which was implemented 2018. It took a while until companies got up, have done it, and that was a proper regulation, right? Looking to COP26, there are certain measures which will come, some regulatory measures, right? You have informed about, but also the pressure coming from investors who will have pressure from the market. That doesn't come tomorrow, that doesn't come in 3 months, right? And the other thing we need to keep in mind is ESG is like an own FTE you will need in a company, right? It's like an own person. Seeing that was in November, and many financial years are from January to December, budget was closed, right? So I think this year, 2022, budget will look different. Also for the M&A, I think from an M&A perspective, during the due diligence on your company, you will be asked where you stand, right? And it's also not unusual in the investor reporting. And I think maybe until now it was more inquiring and you ticked off boxes. Now it will be more than that if one investor sees there's no development. So all of this, I strongly believe, will come. Let's give it another 8 to 9 months. Have a full year of business cycle and it will come. You're right if you now answer with, well, we don't have time. Unfortunately, it does require that time for business to answer, because no GC alone can hold the flag up, right? No matter what we carry inside of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important not to place too much pressure on GCs. You know, that can be just as paralyzing as inaction, obviously. In your opinion, Yasmin, do you think that a legislative framework would be enough? I mean, I don't want to say enough, but do you think it will be the main catalyst behind some of the changes that we would like to see?
It's the fastest change you can achieve, depending on how fast you get legislation. And legislation can be very bureaucratic as well, specifically in the EU. We have different interests. But once you have regulation, there is hardly any excuse possible. But of course, regulation needs, again, also someone controlling, auditing it, right? So legislation itself, not per se, but I think certain things we have in the companies, and especially as lawyers, you know, the documentation in Germany, according to law, that you need to notarize, that you have to put things into paper, right? It doesn't help the purpose of COP26, even if it's maybe a small percentage, but if we all produce paper in Germany, it doesn't help, right? And there is also, if you look into courts, you get horrified. So digitalization, we're far away from it, right? I was used to it in a third world country, living and working in Southeast Asia, seeing that in Berlin, wow. Right? This is something we all need to help. We need to understand our government is maybe not that far, right? Not pointing fingers, standing up, doing stuff.
That makes a lot of sense. Pamela, I saw a lot of enthusiastic nodding there. Please feel free to chip in.
Yes, very keen to hear from you, because, you know, you're not a GC, but you work with GCs and have that external perspective. So we really value that as well.
Yes, and I completely agree with what Silvio and Yasmin have already said. I think COP26 has certainly raised the awareness of everybody, not just those of us who work in this space. I mean, this was the 26th time that there has been a COP conference, and I think it's the first time that the general public has actually heard about it in the media, right? So it definitely received much more coverage than prior years. I agree with Yasmin that it's almost too soon to know whether companies will act. But I think along with the raised awareness of COP26, what I'm seeing is a raised awareness with companies exerting pressure on supply chains. And that includes law firms. So from my perspective, my law firm clients are seeing the pressure coming from their clients asking about their ESG performance and commitments. And that, I think, is going to motivate behavioral change much earlier than regulation, especially here in the US. I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic that regulation is going to be coming anytime soon. But what is happening is stakeholder pressure and stakeholder expectations. And that, I think, more than anything, is changing behavior. And to your point, Yasmin, about it's going to take time. You know, I'm stating the obvious here, but frankly, we've had decades to deal with this and we haven't. I remember talking about climate change when I was in elementary school, and that was a lot of years ago. So we've wasted a whole lot of time, unfortunately, and I think action has to be urgent and quick. And I think the stakeholder pressure is what's going to drive company change, because even unlisted companies like law firms are getting that kind of pressure.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, sorry, Anna, if you wanted to chip in, I just wanted to say that one of the key drivers for change, it seems to me, and please feel free to chip in, everyone, is that people, you know, will act on something whether there's an incentive to do so, rather than a reason to feel bad for inaction, if that makes sense. That's why we really try to speak the language of trying to point towards where the future is. As Sylvia said, we believe that, yes, it could very well be an extinction-like event for these organizations that don't adapt, and it could very well be too late. Is your position, Pamela, that we also have to feel a bit ill at ease and move forward and harness that? Or should...
Yes, I do. And fortunately, I guess, the pandemic has given us an opportunity. So we have completely changed the traditional business model practically overnight when the world shut down. So inertia is the strongest and hardest hurdle to get over when you're trying to affect change. Well, inertia was completely disrupted when the pandemic hit. So this is our opportunity as we emerge from the pandemic, and I'm hopeful we're emerging from the pandemic. This is the time to institute new practices, different practices, rethink, reconsider everything we used to consider was normal. Because in hindsight, I'm not sure it ever really should have been. And I'll give you the example of air travel. You know, the biggest contributor to carbon for law firms is not paper. It is their air travel. And I'm talking by orders of magnitude. That is their biggest contributor. So we haven't been traveling at the same pace now for 2 years. So let's be really thoughtful and deliberate about how we get back to air travel and how much of it is actually needed to be a successful law firm. We've just proven it's not very much.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, from a GC perspective, right? The same happened the last 2 years. There were no travel. It worked. I mean, I'm working for a tech company, right? We live by it. We live by the word. You can work from everywhere. You don't have to meet. Of course, there's the social part of it, which I think we as a company solved very well. And yes, less travel for business. That's very important. And I think the pandemic has shown us exactly what you say, Pamela, disruption, not just thinking it, living it, it's possible, right? And it all came to standstill and we changed the habits we have. The thing is not going back, right? And maybe from the beginning, and again, you see, even the pressure from the stakeholders comes ultimately from the market, and the pressure on the market from potential regulation. Let's be open here, right? It's not the good people and people who are really convinced speaking here and getting people and companies to change their mind. I'm not saying companies don't have a conscience, right? They do. But ultimately the chain reaction happens because we all expecting some, you know, some restrictions, regulatory, and some less benefits to those who are not ESG aware, right, going forward. And then of course that business is not interesting for a company to invest in. So that's the chain reaction tripling down. That's the, you know, top-down approach. But I truly, truly believe there's also a bottom-up approach. And this is what we're talking about today as well. What can we do as a company? What can I do as an ESG? And we have often a mediator role within a company. So talk, right? Sit down with a C-level if you don't have awareness in the company, and talk about ESG, see what you can do. And even if everyone does a little bit, maybe travel, maybe paper, whatever it be, let's cut down, and all of us as one person creating something which adds to the global warming, right? Privately and professionally and as a company. So that is one thing we should always keep in the back of our head. And this is the one thing we always need to remember. It's not finger pointing. Nevertheless, as I say, I think ultimately everything comes from expected regulation. If you look at the top-down scalable approach of changing something, and their lobbying will be required as well, right? The regulation needs to come. We need to change the way of living. Things have to be digital. Yes, you know, electricity requires also some energy, which again needs to be produced and partially leaves a footprint, but it has to come from every angle. And I think without lobbying, majority might not change.
You mentioned lobbying, Yasmin. So what form do you think that do you feel that has an important role in playing? I'm fully aware, by the way, that we have lots of very interesting questions, and we would love to get to those as soon as we can. But just because you mentioned that very interesting bit about lobbying, that seems to suggest that, the power of connecting and seizing the right ears at the right time, that could be a bit of a game changer. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, it's from an ESG perspective, and Pamela is very right, that paper is not the main factor. Pamela, if you look here to Germany, we need to notarize every deal, right? When you buy a house, everything needs to go to a notary, and you end up with piles of paper, right? For each case, for everyone. Multiply this for an entire country, right? We are in a digital century. We have blockchain, which is notarization basically, right? So paper vanishes as a notary as well. So, and blockchain has maybe a potential risk of being hacked, but ultimately it's as safe, right? And lobbying that these regulations change, which is day to day for a GC. Let's go away from paper, but therefore we need the regulations. We need maybe regulations also to allow people, if they don't have to, that they can work from home, that they can work from everywhere, right? You now hear more and more tensions. Everyone should go back to work, like 5 days a week or how many days? Question mark. It wasn't necessarily 2 years. I would like to see the financial statements of these companies, whether they had, besides the direct effect of the pandemia, whether people may not even be more effective, right? So these are the questions also important, and without lobbying, things won't change. And but I think also what we had briefly discussed with the panelists, not now, but and Pamela and Sylvia to budge in here, I think the large players who really live quite a bit of footprint, they have a lot of pressure, right? Since COP26 to change, to make sure they don't leave such a footprint. And they are actually the ones in connection with associations, doing something for their CRS and making lobbying, become true, but also us, smaller ones, medium ones, right? We're all part of associations like Bitcomi in Germany and all of this. We need to speak up.
And make sure that those associations are lobbying for the right steps, not lobbying to protect the status quo.
Absolutely, and if I may add, because obviously Yasmin, apologies, was making a point around the mediator role that the general counsel have. Just a couple of thoughts on actually the role of general counsel, and I'd like to quote here John Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, because when addressing the American Bar Association back in August, he said something that really resonated with me. So he said, "You're all climate lawyers now," and he added, "whether you want to be or not." And I sort of particularly enjoy the bit around whether you want to be or not, because I think it delivers a sense of urgency and a sense of inevitability. So it is no longer a choice, right? So deciding to, as a general counsel, address climate considerations and focusing on ESG, it's actually a business imperative from a variety of levels, from a variety of perspectives. Let's just think about the rise in ESG litigations, which has so many different dimensions. I think we're probably all familiar with the Shell case that was adjudicated by a Dutch court in last year in 2021, and the rise in the affirmation of parent company liability for potentially pollution or other, let's say, environmental actions carried out by subsidiaries in Africa or in Asia or anywhere, or the rise in disclosure litigation. And so investors and shareholders and regulators taking enforcement actions against companies who fail to communicate adequately the ESG credentials of the company, or that sort of fraudulently make claims in connection with environmental credentials or environmental track record. So I think ultimately a general counsel that fails to take notice of all of this, even if one looks at, let's say, ESG and climate change from the very narrow lenses, from my perspective of risk, legal, and regulation, should definitely act. And those who don't are probably the general counsel who are sleeping at the wheels, and they really need to take action. Now, how you do that? I think there are various steps in the process. The first one probably is education, and education is absolutely fundamental. And one sort of key perspective in education from my view, it's actually the need to avoid insularity. And that means looking at what, let's say, peers, competitors, and others in the market are actually doing, which are the key initiatives from an ESG perspective. For instance, just to mention my personal experience, I've been working with Lawyers for Net Zero, which is an organization that effectively strives to create a platform for general counsel to have a community and to have a forum for discussion of ESG themes and obviously net zero considerations, and also strives to share knowledge, because again, that is absolutely fundamental for the general counsel to be equipped with the skills, capabilities, and information that are required to then raise awareness internally, which is the second sort of step, very important step in the process. And the third one, from my perspective, is the emphasis on corporate governance, which cannot be emphasized much. So corporate governance and the role of the general counsel will have in respect of corporate governance and in sort of guiding the board of directors in navigating a completely sort of changing landscape of directors' duties, fiduciary duties, how you effectively make sure that you scan the horizon to make sure that all the entire catalog of relevant stakeholders are taken into account when making decisions in respect of how you actually manage the corporation is absolutely fundamental. And it is, from my perspective, a necessity for general counsel to take the lead on that role.
Maybe to reply to the questions in the chat, one was directed to me directly, and both basically go to the same direction. What can you do remote and online and not be in one premises? So to the first one directed to me, no, I haven't been part of greener arbitrations. But what I can tell you is I've been to 2 acquisitions, cross-border, cross-continental during the pandemic. It was all online. No one of us flew anywhere, right? Between Germany, US, Germany, Canada, including the PMI, which we finalized for Canada, right? So, and I think this is even seen as a much larger project than an arbitration or work from somewhere else, right? It is not just the legal part you do, not just the due diligence, but melting 2 companies, two different companies with their employees into one, right? Creating synergies, getting to know each other. And I've done it twice within the last 2 years, right? Our company did it and we were all part of it. So having done that all online, I think we can, to answer the second question, whether, you know, remote working is new disruptive real trend, I would answer it's not a trend, it's reality. We live since 2 years and it actually works.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yasmin.
I'd like to, can I chime in
please.
on one thing that Silvio said, which I think is really critical? I absolutely agree with the statement that John Kerry made, that we are all climate lawyers now, whether we want to be or not. I would expand that beyond lawyers. It's like we all have to care about the climate now, whether we want to or not. But I also think it's, general counsel are really, really brilliant and smart people, but I don't think we can assume that they can suddenly become climate experts in their role. They really need to hire the expertise or invest in becoming an expert. And I just noticed this morning on LinkedIn that Ernst & Young has collaborated with the university, and they are paying for anyone, no matter their role, anyone at Ernst & Young or EY who wants to get a master's in climate science, they will pay for it. That is a proactive step towards making sure we all are competent to function in the coming world.
Fantastic point. That wasn't something I was aware of. Thank you, Pamela. A very interesting point that has been raised in one of the questions is the prospect of one participant is asking, did COP26 not bring the investors and media to the table? Is this not a case of the legal framework playing catch up? And that introduces a nice notion in that, do we feel that, is it possible that chains of events have been set into motion that the legal framework cannot possibly catch up with? The pace of change is such that, is it possible to catch up? I wanted to get your take on this.
Yeah, if I can comment on that one, I tend to agree. I think, probably the most powerful force to, let's say, propel the affirmation of the sustainability paradigm at the moment is actually pressure coming from investors. So, and I could not agree more. And I think if one looks at, how, let's say, the big asset managers, the big investors have behaved over the past few years, that I think provides the biggest incentive for everyone and for companies in particular to catch up and to actually embrace the new sustainability paradigm. The key shift from my perspective is that sustainability and climate action now is not seen as, let's say, merely ancillary to value creation or something detracting from value creation or just a mere charitable pursuit. But now I think there is quite a lot of evidence in the market that investors are starting to see climate change, net zero, and the transition to a greener economy as being in an organic relationship with value creation, which means that ultimately that impacts financial performance. And I think that is the key element that will drive change. The fact that, as again, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, said, we focus on sustainability not because we are environmentalists, but because we're capitalists and because we have fiduciary duties vis-a-vis our investors. And the only way we can satisfactorily comply with our fiduciary duties is if we consider climate risk for what it is. And that means considering climate risk as investment risk, because obviously the physical risk of assets being depreciating in value as a result of extreme climate events, as well as the transition risk. And so the risk of an asset class or an entire industry becoming completely obsolete as a result of a transition to net zero are actually very tangible effects, and effects that are being considered in the pricing that investors across the globe attribute to certain asset classes. So that ultimately, I think, is the most probably powerful force behind the affirmation of the sustainability paradigm. Obviously, I think another powerful one is the legal and regulatory framework. That might potentially be playing catching up, but I think that is also sort of very important. And if one looks at the rise in, for instance, ESG fundraising or green fundraising in Europe, where the legal and regulatory landscape in connection with, for instance, the SFDR, the taxonomy regulation, the low carbon benchmark regulation, and building up on that is definitely playing a big role in how investment decisions are made by investors and how capital is being allocated.
Great. Thank you, Silvio. I'm aware that there's quite a few more questions that have come in. So maybe just even going back to an earlier one, I think someone was interested in supply chains and whether, so I guess maybe more one for Yasmin and or Silvio. The question was, are the panel assessing their supply chains against their own ESG posture? And if so, how?
Yeah, I haven't done that myself now, but we have in Germany now a new law where you really have to go deep dive into your suppliers, specifically if they're overseas. I mean, this is a relatively straightforward, maybe not very easy exercise. Is you need to do your internal due diligence first. You need to, the best is get a shared doc, right? Include all the different departments. Every department has to assign someone, ask them to put in the supplier you have. So you first need an overview of the supplier, right? And I guess you will have the process of your company, the supply chain processes already lined up. Your COO will have that, right? But ultimately, you need to go through your suppliers and then see whether which one is basically one, and depending on the services and product, of course, you deliver, right? If you're in energy, it might be different than for us in technology, where basically it's all, our suppliers are rather providing tools and anything online than really tangible or any production which can leave a footprint. Nevertheless, certain regulations also do apply on us, depending on what kind of employees our supplier has. Is there any child work, whatnot, right? So you have to check on that. So the first step is due diligence. Once you have that for the past, you can have a look. Where do I, and then send questionnaires out to the suppliers. Moving forward, it is about you to educate, right? So you are the owner of the project, or you're second in charge as a GC, and you will have monthly by monthly meetings with the people from the relevant departments internally. You can see whether you need to catch up, and they need to know, they need to inform you. And then on your checklist of suppliers, one of the questions when you get an agreement to check on a supplier is that supplier ESG compliant, right? And this is for moving forward. But the educational part, this is really either onto you or most likely someone, as Pamela was saying, a specialist you get in who knows more about ESG.
Silvio, I think you're still on mute. We'd love to hear from you as well, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I would say that I agree with Yasmin, and I think a new piece of legislation will probably be coming in Europe in the next few months, the sustainability due diligence regulation that will effectively require a vast sort of majority of companies to carry out an in-depth sort of due diligence, including in connection with the supply chain. I also agree with Yasmin that, you know, how you sort of approach due diligence in connection with supply chain and ESG considerations is very industry specific. So I'm wary of generalizing here, but I think, you know, what we are seeing in the financial sector, and in particular in private equity investments, is we're starting to sort of ask, when we sort of diligence one specific opportunities, in addition to asking questions around how the company deals, for instance, with anti-bribery and anti-corruption vis-a-vis the supply chain. Now the question has been asked, how do you address ESG considerations in connection with the supply chain? And that is a question that now is that concept is resonating in the market, and I think we're probably going to see more and more due diligence questions being asked in connection with ESG in the supply chain.
I think there are a number of tools, and you're probably familiar with most of these, but there are a number of tools now that my law firm clients are starting to see their clients use. EcoVadis, Supply Shift, Ethisphere, Integrity Next, all sorts of platforms that are now available to assess your supply chain. And, you know, that includes law firms. Law firms are increasingly getting these questionnaires and requirements from clients, including CDP, which is Carbon Disclosure Project, which is quite rigorous to try to respond to, and it takes a team of people to be responsive to CDP. So I go back to the earlier comment that what is going to move the market is not necessarily just regulation. It is investor pressure, and even for private companies, it's going to be supply chain and other stakeholder pressure.
That makes a lot of sense, in the sense that it ties into nicely what we're saying, that change will be both bottom up and top down. And, you know, it does make a certain amount of sense that, you know, we would see incremental change from various aspects, and then, you know, past a certain critical point, you know, change would be easier to implement in all sorts of ways. We've been talking a lot about ESG matters, which we care about very passionately, but another thing we care about passionately is lawyers and practicing law. And I wanted to ask the question to all of you: how do you see this as an opportunity? How do you see it as the title goes, unlocking the potential of GCs? Do you see that as an opportunity to make them more central, to potentially highlight some failures in the way that some of them might be working in, or limitations in the avenues of communication. I just wanted to pose that question to all of you, really, and just get your perspective on how does ESG, is it an opportunity? Is it, how do you view it?
I view it as an obligation. I feel like helping society migrate to a greener, more just position is in large part exactly why people went to law school in the first place, right? I want to help society be better, be more just. And this opportunity is now presented to us. It's our obligation to take it upon ourselves, to lead with our highest and best skills, to make the change that's necessary to ensure a viable future. And I often use the word viable instead of sustainable, because too many people think sustainable just has to do with climate, when in fact, we're talking about staying viable in all aspects of ESG, not just the climate. And I think lawyers are in a unique position to be the leaders and the catalysts for change that is going to be required for our ongoing viability.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree with Pamela in that. I think that is actually again, and going back to the previous point around whether you want to be or not, that is pretty much an imperative, and so that is something that we have to do. I think again, I'm wary of generalizing here, because obviously, you know, how big a role a general counsel takes in connection with the ESG efforts of their organization depends on a variety of factors. Quite a lot of organizations now have appointed chief sustainability officers or have a dedicated ESG team. So, you know, it might depend. So how sort of big the chunk of ESG related work the general counsel undertakes will really depend on a variety of circumstances. But I think ultimately that there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests the general counsel around the globe are actually taking an active role in connection with ESG, and the pressing of the responsibilities of the general counsel has been expanded to also include ESG considerations. If one looks at the various surveys that have been published, it is very, very clear that one of the key elements the general counsel are focusing on at the moment are ESG considerations. And there was a fairly interesting article that was published in the Financial Times a few months ago that says that such has been the transformation of the role of the general counsel to actually include ESG considerations. The probably general counsel no longer is the job title that captures in the more accurate manner what general counsel actually do, and they're probably chief purpose officer to sort of try and embrace all the various sustainability considerations, which means corporate purpose, ESG, human rights, diversity and inclusion, obviously net zero, are now all within the, let's say, purview, one way or the other, of the general counsel.
Yeah, I do underline that, where my take is also why it eventually, mostly at the beginning, if you don't have a CSO in place, ends up on the desk of the legal team, is it's seen as part of compliance, right? Even if regulation is not there yet, it is being expected. That's the one thing. And the other thing is investor relations, which is often also on the GC's desk. And it is expected that someone can answer. And if it's investor relations, it often ends up on the desk of the GC. So compliance and investor relations often leads us needing to deal with it. Do we have all the knowledge, in-depth knowledge, right? Again, this is ESG is not one department. It is basically like your operations. It is basically tied to your operations, right? You need to be backbone and parallel melted into your operation to understand where you can do something different to have a positive effect, which means as a GC alone, again, you won't get there. It is like with the GDPR, it's a project, it's company-wide. You can play the mom, dad, or whatever, initiate it, never go alone on this journey. You won't make it, right? it will just break your neck, which often happens in smaller entities where it's just dumped on you. Put a hold on, stand up and say, okay, this is not to be done alone. It might be compliance, but it's company-wise compliance and investor relations. So organization, organize yourself, get a project up, make it cross-departmental from day one, not after 3 months when you realize you haven't moved the needle because you can't do it alone.
Can I make a comment on that? I think what you said was really important about it's often dropped on the GC's desk because it's seen as a compliance issue. And that is a trap that you want to avoid, because ESG is not just compliance. Similar to a diversity and inclusion officer being housed in HR gives the impression that DE&I is just an issue that's going to be handled by HR. If a chief, even if you have a chief sustainability officer, and if they're housed in the legal department, it's going to send the message that this is just a compliance issue. If they're housed in marketing, then it's just a marketing tactic. If it's housed in HR, then it's really just about DE&I. So you really have to be careful in a company where you put the ESG responsibility so that it is a company-wide strategic initiative, and the ESG person is the hub of all the other chiefs, and it has to be an equal in order to be connected at the hip with everything that has to happen throughout the firm, throughout the company.
Yeah, whereby the only small objection I have on this is it really depends on the size of the company, where you can really get 1 or 2 additional FTEs, or whether you have to work with what you have, right? But the one thing I really also underline what Pamela is saying is don't do it alone. It's not legal only. And again, it's not even compliance yet. There is no regulation of yet.
Right. Right.
But it is expected, and yes, it is investor relations, but nothing you can do alone.
Sylvia, do you also agree with this notion of collaboration is key?
I do. Apologies. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. No, absolutely. I think GCs had to avoid again the over eagerness trap, and that is yet another point. So even if something is dropped on your desk and you want to prove that you can actually take the lead and on ESG and sustainability, I think that is definitely a collective and cross-functional exercise, because ESG cuts across so many different dimensions within a corporation that it cannot be just the general counsel. There are, at the very least, and again, just to focus on the let's say legal officers within a corporation that need to be enlisted and that the general counsel need to be working with. One is obviously the chief compliance officer, there is one, and the other one is the corporate secretary. Because, as I said before, the role of the board of directors and now the general counsel and the various legal officers escalate relevant ESG considerations to the board of directors is absolutely fundamental from my perspective.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, I think, so again, someone in the audience was saying before that maybe going back to our actual initial survey, which sort of kicked off this whole discussion, that maybe part of the reason for the higher optimism in the last poll was that it was actually sort of done in the run up to COP26. So it was in everyone's minds. There was not much tension on climate issues. And maybe that also meant there was slightly higher optimism on the outcomes, and that kind of has waned now. So I guess a question for me, sort of maybe one of the concluding questions as well, looking at the time, is sort of how, do you have any sort of final thoughts on how can we now kind of keep the momentum going? Is there anything specific that you feel like, yeah, people can do to really kind of drive this conversation and keep it going?
Comment on something Silvio said earlier, because he was talking about that this is an imminent risk and it is incumbent upon boards to deal with this. I think if you go way back to Milton Friedman, who said the role of a corporation is to return profits to shareholders, and for so long that focused on short-term profits regardless of carbon or climate. But right now, short-term profits are dependent on carbon or climate being addressed. And so finally, Milton Friedman's advice and ESG are aligning because they're both short-term prospects right now. You cannot make short-term decisions and ignore long-term because, you know, the climate crisis is at our doorstep.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I think again, looking at the market is probably the more powerful incentive at this stage. Obviously one can look at ideology and one can look at a variety of things, but I think, you know, the one thing that will definitely continue to push the sustainability agenda is actually the markets. And again, if one looks at how investors are making their decision, how you know, investors are in pretty much every market have established this organic link between, as Pamela said, ESG and financial performance. Those companies that want to remain active in the market, and those companies who don't want to risk being completely locked out of capital markets in the very sort of short term, need to act. And obviously that is a process, and so it will take time. And I think, you know, obviously the earlier you start, the better will be your position in the next few months.
Yeah, I can just underline what Pamela and Sylvia was saying. And in addition, if you ask what specifically a GC, a lawyer in-house can do, is we can sometimes use the compliance umbrella, even if it's not today, right, to make things move in a company, right? We can take it as a reason for let's be prepared and start, right, to kickstart things. We do have that position. And on the other side, very interesting to hear from Silvio that you're working with lawyers, right, net zero. So on the one side, we are the professionals, but all of us is also an individual with specialized lawyers, right? If we as a person having own families, looking into the future, wants to make a change, then let's use what we have, right? Let's use our profession, let's use our knowledge, and give a little bit from our private time maybe as well.
Great, thank you so much, Yasmin. I think that's actually an excellent statement to conclude with. I think we are almost out of time. I don't think any other questions have come in. Apologies if I have missed anything. Hopefully there will be another opportunity to address that if I have. But yeah, thank you so much to Silvio, Yasmin, Pamela for your time today. I think it was an excellent discussion and lots of food for thought. Yeah, and if you have any final, we have got, I think, 1 or 2 minutes for any final thoughts, but Chris,
please.
No, apologies. I was just saying that what Yasmin said, I think it's a very nice note to end our webinar, and a very uplifting one too. So
yes, and I think we need that. I think this is also probably key.
Definitely.
It is not, doesn't always just become doom and gloom all the time, but yeah, that we need to see sort of the positive sides as well, definitely. Great, thank you again so much. Thanks to our audience for attending, hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, hopefully until the next one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.